Good afternoon. My name is David Nelson. I'm the Education Assistant at our museum down in Naples. Just a little brief introduction to our museum. Three things we like to tell people. The museum started as a school project for 7th grade students at Golden Gate Middle School. They did a module about the Holocaust and got so involved in the subject that when it finished, they wanted to carry it on. They came up with an exhibition about the Holocaust. This traveled around Naples and ended up being our museum. So that's quite interesting. So if you're 7th graders or above, that's something you can do as well. The world is your oyster. The second thing we like to talk about is the fact that we have access, or we did have access, to survivors of the Holocaust. As the gentleman said, a lot of these people are now no longer with us because they're all born in the 1920s and 1930s, so they're in their 90s, some. We do have some that are still alive and come and give talks at the museum, and it's fascinating and it's great to be able to talk to somebody who was there that did it. The third thing we talk about is our boxcar. Cattle car, they used to be called, they now call them boxcars. This is a traveling boxcar that travels around Florida, and this is an example of the sort of vehicle that took Jews to the concentration camps, and I believe it's coming here very shortly. So make sure you have a look at the boxcar and get the impression of what happened. Up to 100 people would be put in that boxcar, and if you get inside it, you'll think, how on earth did that happen? There's only room for about 20, but they packed them in and they took them to the concentration camps. So that's an awful thing, but do have a look at it. As I said, we talked about survivors, and a lot of them survivors are no longer with us, but we do have sons and daughters of survivors, and today you're going to hear from Stuart Mest, whose parents were involved in the Holocaust, and he's got a fascinating story to tell about their time. So enjoy that. Stu, over to you.
Thank you, David. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, sir.
Great. Now, the Holocaust is a very difficult subject. Believe you me, I understand that. It's a difficult subject to talk about. It's a difficult subject to listen to. But it is important because of the lessons that we learn from the Holocaust. And that is really the wish of every survivor. And I know that was my parents' wish. Their motto was never again, as you may know. And when they said never again, they meant never again should the Holocaust, which was a genocide, happen to any group of people, Jewish, non-Jewish. That was their hope and their goals. And that's why Holocaust education is so important. So I know you began talking about the Holocaust, so let's start with a definition, which is complicated, but I think it's a good starting point for the discussion. And then we're going to discuss a little bit about how the Nazis came into power, which I know you've discussed. And then we're going to see how the Holocaust affected two people, my parents. The Holocaust was the state-sponsored, systematic persecution and annihilation of European Jewry. Other groups were involved and got swept up, but the Jews were the target by Nazi Germany and its collaborators from 1933 to 1945. I think that's a good overall definition. That's been modified over the years, but I like that one because it opens up the discussion. Why 1933? That's when Hitler is appointed chancellor, and he comes to office the end of January 1933. He was not elected. He was appointed by the President Hindenburg because the powers to be felt that they could control him, and they were oh so wrong, as we know today. It was state-sponsored. It was the government who started it, initiated it, propagated it through propaganda, advertising, print literature, music, you name it, to get their message out and to indoctrinate the people into this. It didn't start from the grassroots level and work its way up. It was the government working its way down. At the time, there were about 9 million Jews living in Europe. 6 million perished, 2/3 of Europe's Jewish population. Out of the 6 million, probably closer to 6.5 million, 1.5 million were children. That was the primary target of the Nazis. Because if you eliminate the children, you eliminate the people. 1.5 million children, your age and younger, perished. The chances of a child surviving a Holocaust in Europe was about 6 to 8%. That was it. If you were an adult, it was about 30%. But what I think is the most important word in the definition is collaborators. Because the government couldn't have done it on its own. If you stood by and watched and said nothing, you were a passive collaborator. You were a bystander. When the Nazis invaded countries and took over the governments and installed their people, the local people helped actively. They were active collaborators. But again, most people were passive and just watched and said nothing out of fear in many respects. But you could argue that the whole world was a passive collaborator as Hitler comes to power. Remember, World War I ends in 1918 with the Treaty of Versailles, and Germany's on the losing side of the war. And as part of the treaty, Germany has to admit defeat, which is humiliating to the German people. They have to disband their military, which was also humiliating for them. They had to give back a lot of the colonies that they had acquired over the years to the Allies, which they didn't like. But they had to make reparation payments, money to the victors. In today's dollars, Germany had to pay back the Allies about 2/3 of $1 trillion, about $650 billion in timed payments. Germany's economy was in shambles after World War I, but they actually started making the payments. But as conditions worsened, they couldn't make the payments any longer. They had a democratic style of government after World War I, parliamentary style, like what we have in Britain. And so a lot of political parties formed, all trying to gain seats in local government and in the national parliament, their Reichstag. One of those parties was the National Socialist Democratic Party, the Nazi Party, which organized. Hitler eventually became the leader of that party. He was a vehement anti-Semite. He despised the Jewish people, as did his followers. And the Nazis did not create anti-Semitism. That has been around for hundreds, if not thousands of years, dating back to ancient Egypt, if you look at hieroglyphic writings. People have disliked the Jewish people because of social reasons, economic reasons, religious reasons, political reasons. And stereotypes, anti-Semitic tropes, caricatures has been progressed through the ages. The Nazis did not create it, but they used it to their advantage. Hitler tried to overthrow the government in 1922 in the Beer Hall Putsch, which is when they marched on the capital in Bavaria and they were arrested and he was put in prison. That's where he wrote the book Mein Kampf, in which he describes exactly what he wants to do. It's published, and everyone says he's crazy. But the world knew what he wanted to do. He did not hide it. He had a group of followers that believed in him, and they got their message out through propaganda. They used newspapers, songs that you would hear on the radio. But their most effective technique was what? Anyone have any idea? We see it in our society today. Bullying. That was their most effective technique to get their message out. Bullying, intimidation. If you look back at videos and pictures, you saw their followers were wearing brown shirts. That was the original SA, that they would go around beating up people, intimidating people, breaking up stores, telling you not to shop here or go there. They eventually morphed into the SS over time. But that's how they got their message out. Bullying. And you see today in our society today how dangerous bullying is. You see it more than I do. They took advantage of every possible way to get their message out. But if you look at election results in the 20s, the Nazi Party really doesn't do that well. Remember, in Germany, population was roughly 60 million after World War I. You know how many Jewish people lived in Germany at that time? 600,000. So 1% of the population was Jewish. 1%. So most German people had never come into contact with a Jewish person. But yet, the Nazis felt that the Jews were responsible for everything wrong in Germany before World War I, why they lost World War I, and everything that was wrong in their society after World War I. Unemployment, they had high inflation, so their money was worthless. People couldn't feed themselves, get medical care. Their society was in shambles. So it was convenient to say the Jews. And Hitler equated the Jews with the communists because the Russian Revolution had already occurred. The Communist Party was stabilizing in neighboring Russia, and they were a threat to Germany. What happens in 1929? Stock market crashes in our country. The world wasn't as interconnected as we are today. There was no internet, etc. Our economy goes in the toilet here in the United States, as you know, and it spread through Europe. Germany's economy, which wasn't very good, really tanked. And it was at that point, that's when the Nazi Party gained up to 30 to 32% of the seats in their parliament. They had a plurality, never a majority. Never a majority. And that was when the decision was made by the president and his associates, who were conservatives, to appoint Hitler so they could control him. And oh, so wrong they were. Hitler comes to power in 1933 at the end of January. And within a month, the Parliament building burns. The Reichstag burns. They say it was the communists who did it. And basically, Hitler, at that point, under the Enabling Act, becomes a dictator in all essence. Everything had to go through him. And what's the first thing he does? He and his party. They open up Dachau. It was a concentration camp. But it had opened in the spring of 1933 for all the political prisoners who opposed Hitler. German society was very much into a pseudoscience called eugenics, which was very popular in Europe. It started in Europe, in England, in the late 1800s, very popular in the United States in 1900s, all the way up to World War II, actually. But the German people, scientists, and sadly to say, the medical establishment were very much a part of it. I'm a physician. They firmly believed that Anglo-Saxons, Nordic, Aryan, superior races. Everyone else was inferior. The Nazi Party felt to heal Germany, they needed to cleanse Germany of all inferior races. They said the Jews were a race. There's a Jewish gene. Of course, there isn't. But he started right away in 1933 They had a sterilization law in which physically and mentally handicapped were sterilized so they couldn't have children, because they wanted to eliminate these people from their society. They were drains on society economically because of their upkeep and care in facilities, nursing homes, psychiatric institutions. The medical establishment was firmly behind it and actively involved. That doesn't happen without the physicians. On a side note, if you look at the Nazi Party in Germany, maybe 10% of the population had joined the Nazi Party during the war. Nearly 50% of the physicians were active Nazi Party members. Mind-blowing that the physicians were lockstep and barrel with the Nazi Party. This program of sterilization progressed to a euthanasia program by the time World War II started. You all know what euthanasia, the word, means? You know, if you had a dog or a cat or an animal that was sick and parents took them to the vet, and the vet said, there's really not much more we can do, we're going to put him to sleep because he's suffering. The Nazis practiced euthanasia on physically and mentally handicapped patients, psychiatric illnesses. By the time World War II started, 100,000 German citizens were put to sleep by lethal injection, were being placed in gas chambers. The medical establishment firmly backing this up, and in fact, doing it. They had euthanasia courts in which cases were presented, but the actual killing was done by physicians. They had perfected ways to murder efficiently, primitive gas chambers that we see during World War II. So the Holocaust doesn't happen if during the 1930s they hadn't perfected mass killing at home in Germany. And again, the physicians were actively involved. So that brings us to September 1st, 1939, which is the actual beginning of World War II, when, first slide, when the Germans invaded Poland this way. Remember, they had already agreed with the Soviet Union that the Soviet Union gets this part of Poland as long as they don't counterattack the Germans. And Stalin took that agreement because Russia, Soviet Union, was still in shambles after World War I. They were trying to rebuild their military, their economy wasn't great, and Stalin took it. And they still control this part of Poland till today. They never gave it up. But this is the direction they came. Now, my father was born in the city of Lodz. My mother was born in a small village near this area of Poland, right near the Soviet border. Just for a point of reference. Next slide. So my dad was born June 23rd, 1925, so in the city of Lodz, very large industrial city, as it is today. He lived with his mom and his dad and a younger brother in an apartment building, in an apartment complex. Jewish people, non-Jewish people, all mixed. I used to ask them, what did you guys know as you were growing up? He was a teenager when the war started. He was 14. He had just had his bar mitzvah the year before. They listened to the radio and they knew what was going on in Germany. They knew about Hitler. And what he and his friends thought was that the world, America, wouldn't let Hitler get away with it. It was bad enough what he did in Germany, but they would stop it. And oh, so wrong they were. Oh, so wrong. Again, the world was a passive collaborator. They knew all through the 30s that the German Army, Navy, Air Force was rebuilt. Nobody said a word. In America, the UK, around the world. They knew. Next. He vividly remembered, he would recount to me how the German troops marched into the city of Poland the second week of September. They came to his apartment building, the soldiers. The locals in the apartment building identified who were the Jews living in the apartment complex. They stormed into the apartment. They said, "You're a Jew. No more school. There's a curfew. And you have to," they gave his mother the Jewish stars of David that she had to sew on their clothes. So when they went out on the street, they had to wear that to identify themselves as a Jew. Now, that's not the first time that Jewish people had to wear certain kinds of clothing. Again, the Germans didn't make this up. In the Middle Ages, in some countries, Jewish people had to wear a distinctive hat that showed that they were Jewish. Now, again, the Nazi Party just looked at history and sort of repeated history. Next. That's an example of the Jewish Star of David that was sewn on his clothes. Next. He was in high school, as I said, but wasn't allowed to attend. Curfew started. And immediately after the Germans installed their government in the city of Lodz, they began creating a ghetto in the city, as they did in practically every city and village, to house and segregate the Jewish people. Again, they didn't come up with this concept of a ghetto. Anyone have any idea where the first ghetto recorded in history was? Venice, Italy, in the 1300s. Jewish people were segregated into a ghetto. If you ever visit Italy, you can still see where that ghetto was because the boundaries are still marked in signs. There was also a ghetto in Rome. There was a ghetto in Florence. And it's marked on signs. So again, they didn't create this idea. They said, wow, it worked back then. We're going to do the same thing. But this time, they herded the Jews into the most uninhabitable portions of the cities. In the city of Lodz, they took a 1 square mile area, which was the most underdeveloped area, and that was where the ghetto was. 150,000 Jewish people were herded into this area. He and his family lived in a 2-bedroom apartment with 3 other families. Overcrowding. And needless to say, the sewage system didn't work well. So the toilets didn't work. There is raw sewage everywhere in the ghettos. Lodz, Warsaw, you name the city or village. Same idea. And the Nazis knew that. Because when you have raw sewage, you have dirty water, people develop salmonella, massive diarrhea, you die. And because of overcrowding and poor conditions, typhus spreads. And that's what the Nazis wanted. They also limited food. Initially, it was up to 1,000 calories a day, but as the war progressed, maybe 200 calories a day. So starvation ensued pretty quickly. And who were the first to die? The kids. You guys. Just picture yourself. Can you survive on 400 calories a day? No. Especially as a young, growing child, teenager. You can't. The adults, the elderly who were sick, starved to death, and the kids were the first to die. Hitler called the kids worthless mouths to feed. I'm good? Okay. That's what he used to say. They're worthless mouths to feed. They need to be eliminated. Next. As I said, food rationing. You could see that people were starving to death. And if you see a chronology of pictures in the ghetto from 1939 on, you'll see people within a few months just aging dramatically in picture form and thinning out. Next. Jewish councils were appointed and did run the ghettos. There was a Jewish police force to keep the peace, firefighters, etc. The leader of the Jewish ghetto in Lodz, Chaim Rumkowski, created all these factories in the city, and the people there produced goods. He felt that would stave off elimination, and in certain respects, he was correct. My father worked in a leather factory making saddles for the German army. 7 days a week, 12 to 14 hours a day, working in a factory. He would get up in the morning, you would go outside, you'd walk down the street, there were dead bodies on the street, you would just walk over them because you had to get to work. And there was raw sewage everywhere. They actually had crews that were responsible to clean up the sewage. This is what life in the Lodz ghetto was like, or any other ghetto. Next. Factories were very profitable for the German government, as records showed after the war. He did get a little extra food that he shared with his family because he was working. And he shielded his younger brother who had a physical defect, who couldn't work. Next. I remember early 1960s, he said the word dehumanization. That's how he described the existence. They beat you down physically because you were starving to death. You lost a lot of weight, so you couldn't resist. And psychologically, that existence in a ghetto beats you to the ground. That was the point. And you died in the ghetto. Next. In the Lodz ghetto, deportation started again in 1944, but as you know, after the Wannsee Conference in January 42, that's when the final solution got authorized. That's when deportation started throughout the ghettos to the extermination centers. And as David described, the deportations, the transportation were cattle cars. They weren't trains. They were cattle cars meant to transport cattle. There was no place to sit. There was no air conditioning. There was no heat. There was no toilet. You would have 80 to 120 people crammed into a small cattle car for a 1 day, 2 day, 3 day ride to wherever you were going to go. No food, no water. Next. So he and his family were deported on August 10th, 44. He had no idea where he was going. You received a paper, a telegram saying you're being resettled. He knew people left the ghetto. They didn't come back. There was whispers, people talked, but you actually never knew where you were going and what's happening. He remembered that cattle ride car to Auschwitz in August. It was 150 degrees, he said, in that cattle car. There was a bucket in the middle of the floor. That was the toilet for the 24-hour ride. On arrival at Auschwitz, he saw the sign, Arbeit macht frei. Work will set you free. And then he knew where he was. Immediately, his mother was separated, and she went to the gas chamber. He and his younger brother went through a selection process. Remember, every able-bodied German male was fighting in the military. The German economy was dependent 100% on slave labor. And the cheapest way of slave labor was through the concentration camp system. So you went through a selection process. And do you know who the people were who made the selections, whether you were going to live or die? Physicians. Initially, it was just regular soldiers, and the German high command said, no, a physician is better able to make a judgment looking at a person and will know whether he can work. So if you were an able-bodied male, at least 12 years old, you could work. And you got selected for slave labor. So my father did. Even though he was gaunt, somewhat emaciated, they figured they could get a month of labor out of him. But his brother had a physical ailment. He had a defect in his leg that he was born with. He and his brother met Joseph Mengele, Dr. Mengele, on the tracks at Auschwitz. His nickname was the Angel of Death. Physicians were in all the death camps and concentration camps. He's the one most famous because of his experiments on identical twins. He was a barbarian, not a physician. That day, there were no twins. So he rounded up all the physically handicapped kids, lined them up on the track that day. And he and his assistant with a stopwatch went behind them and he shot them in the back of the head because he wanted to see how long it would take a child to fall to the ground if you transect the brainstem, which is a part of your brain in the back of your skull, which controls balance and things like that. So he was murdered on the train tracks. That's the image my father saw. That's the image he remembered every day for the rest of his life. He would have nightmares every night. I would hear him wake up screaming, and he never told us why, and my mother told us, don't ask. But she did tell us once why. That was why. He kept picturing Mengele murdering his brother for the rest of his life. Next. He and his father, who was also selected for slave labor, were subsequently transferred to Dachau, concentration camp. Remember, we talked about it in 1933, political prison camp initially, work camp. That's his prisoner number. He worked in a quarry, a lime quarry, and a burial detail. And he was liberated by the U.S. military at the end of April 45. He weighed about 45 pounds at that time. He had typhus. He had 103 temperature. He was delirious. The American military set up makeshift hospitals there, and miraculously he survived. I have his medical records because I was able to get them. Next. He then was placed in a displaced persons camp because there were hundreds of thousands of people at the end of the war with nowhere to go. He was placed in a camp, Feldafing, in Germany. The Allies set up displaced persons camps in Germany, Austria, and there was one in Italy. And he was in Camp Feldafing, where he regained his health, education was resumed, and he actually learned how to drive a truck. The American military taught him how to drive big wheels. Next. They had a camp currency in the camp because life had to get back to normal in certain semblance. Next. That was his picture in 1948, his DP camp photo. Next. He came to the United States August 17th of 49. And he met my mom later on because he went back to high school here in America, even though he finished high school in the DP camp because he wanted his GED certificate. He was working at the time, but he wanted that certificate. Next, he applied for citizenship. That's his declaration to become a citizen of the United States. And next, that's his citizenship paper, which both my parents cherished when they became citizens of America. Next. So that's the story of my dad. We'll talk a little bit about my mom. She was a kid. She was born in February of 1933 in a small village called Dachau, Poland, which no longer exists. Again, it was on the border between Poland and the Soviet Union. Has anyone ever seen the movie Fiddler on the Roof? Got one hand there. It's a small village, farmers, milkman, some shops. That's where a kind of village my mother grew up in, as opposed to my father, who grew up in this large industrial city. She lived with her father and mother when Germany invaded in 1939. She was 6 when the war started. Her older siblings ran into Russia when they heard the Germans were coming. And they were rounded up by the Soviet security forces because they were spies as far as Stalin was concerned. And they got sent to Siberia, to labor camps in Siberia, where they managed to survive for the rest of the war. Next. That is actually a picture of the village of Dachau. I found it amazing. So that's a picture of it. Just little shacks, little houses. Next. Her dad died at the end of 1939, which was quite common. The Germans made that whole town a ghetto. So they surrounded it with barbed wire, and they said they'll be back for them. And she stayed with her mom until 1942, until she was 9 years old. Her mom died from starvation, but before she died, she told my mother, "You got to go save yourself. You got to get out of this ghetto." And my mom did. She managed to get herself out of that ghetto through a defect in the gate. And she met up with the partisans in the underground in the forest area, which were freedom fighters, underground partisans, mostly manned by the Russians and fed and clothed to try to fight the Nazis. And there was also a Polish underground in the forest as well. Food was very limited. And they said, "You're a little kid. We're not giving you a weapon." Not that they had many. And you're going to have to fend for yourself. She's 9 years old. Next. She described that during the day, all of them would hide in large pits they called them bunkers. They would be very deep and very long, and everyone would hide in them during the day, and they would be covered by brush, because the Nazis were scouring the forest areas looking for Jews, the partisans, the freedom fighters. And at night, you would come out, go to the bathroom, try to find some food, and try to find some water. So there were days where you didn't eat, and maybe you got some water. That's what life was like. Next. Again, she was too young to fight. She would go from village to village. She spoke Polish. She'd say she was an orphan, which she was, and that she wasn't Jewish. And some people would take her in for a day or two, give her some clothes, give her some food. But a lot of times they would try to turn her in because you got a 5-pound bag of sugar if you turned in a Jewish kid. A Jewish kid was a prize to the Nazis. And she managed to escape twice as people tried to turn her in. She was actually shot one time and went right through her shoulder area. And I would see that scar. She miraculously survived. Next. She was really malnourished at the end of 1944. And there was a couple, Polish couple, Catholic, who took her in for the last 5 months to 6 months of the war. They fed her, they clothed her, they said she was a niece. They took her to church every Sunday, and she survived the war that way. Next. She stayed with this couple until the end of the war, and then she revealed who she was. They knew that she was Jewish. They didn't want to know. They never asked. And at the end, she told them where she was from and that she wanted to go back to her village, which she did. And of course, there was nothing left of the village. And the American soldiers put her in a DP camp. She was transported to Bamberg, Germany, where she stayed for the next 4 years in a DP camp. Even though my father and my mother both had sponsors in the United States that had to put up money, show that they would be taken care of, et cetera, et cetera. Took both of them 4 years living in a DP camp to come to the States because, believe it or not, immigration laws back then were much tighter and much stricter than they are today. Believe it or not. Next. That's a picture of the DP camp in Bamberg, Germany. And you were housed in a DP camp and you were under guard by American soldiers, not German soldiers. So life was very difficult initially in the DP camps, all through Germany, Austria, and in Italy, because you were a prisoner. Next. That's her camp photo from 1949. She was 16 years old at that time. Next. And she came to the States in July, and both her and my father both went to work the day after they came to this country because their sponsors had arranged work for them. They had to support themselves to buy food and pay rent. So they both went to work. And she met my dad also getting her GED certificate. But what's really touching was, you know, as I was growing up, my mother would write letters. Nobody writes a letter anymore, but back then they did. And on Saturday nights, she would write letters. And I picked it up once, and it was in Polish. It wasn't in English. And I said, "Who are you writing to?" She would write to this Polish couple every week, telling them what's going on, how she was doing, send pictures. And she would send them Christmas gifts, New Year's gifts, birthday gifts. Next. Again, she applied for citizenship. Next. And also became a citizen of the States. Next. That's their engagement picture. And next, that's their wedding picture. And I'm just going to wrap up next. When people would ask my parents why there was so little resistance by the Jewish people, they would get really angry at that. They would say they had no weapons, they had no armies at their disposal, no one was defending them around the world. They tried to maintain as normal a life as possible, even in the ghettos, starving to death. But they continued by saying that the ultimate resistance was survival. That was the ultimate resistance, was to survive, to tell the world what happened, and to make sure that another generation of Jewish children would be born. And that it would never happen again. That's why we're studying the Holocaust, because of all the lessons we learned from it. Thank you.